Good morning, everybody. Welcome to Adult Forum. There are handouts, and there are still plenty of handouts towards the back. I think you'll find one because there'll be a test after. In conjunction with our sermon series on John, we've invited Dr. Quanbeck to speak to our group today about the book of John. Most of you know our pastor, teacher, professor, Phil Quanbeck, but let's give him a round of applause.
Well, good morning. Can you all hear me in the back? If you're in the back, there are a few seats up front here. I'm really pleased. Thank you for the invitation, Enid, to be part of this. I met with all our pastors in early December, and we talked about the Gospel of John. We spent 2 hours going through parts of it and reading a book in preparation. So Pastor Vern has really taken an initiative to make this a really solid experience over the next few months. So I encourage you to show up. And you'll get double Sunday Mass obligation fulfillment. But I'll have a lot of overlap. Vern really said some great things this morning, and Shelley last week on John 1. And I'll talk more about how you can experience it, because I want you to take the challenge of really entering into the Gospel of John, and actually, as it could change your life. And I'm not joking. So anyway, at the end of the semester, I had students write evaluations in my Religion 100 class, and a couple of students who had begun the semester really hostile to the religion of their youth and felt alienated actually said they may go back to church after taking my class. Well, one was Catholic but decided to go Unitarian. But that's better than nothing. That's a start. So I'm from now Augsburg University, and if you want a copy of this, I'll create a PDF. If you want this slideshow, I can send it to you if you email me. And 10 cents in coin. Remember that? I used to actually get that from Merkel Press, the Meet the Press transcripts. They don't do that anymore. Okay, the Word became flesh, and coming from Augsburg, could we kill the front lights here? Would that help?
I got it. Oh.
The Augsburg Seminary seal had the phrase on it, "Ordet blev schut," and that should ring a bell with some of you. And ordet is the word, blev is the verb became, and schut is the word for meat in Norwegian. So meatballs are schuttkake. I can't help that. But I'm really interested in why they chose that to be their, I think it's great, and I think it's Lutheran, but I think I bring a little of that heritage with me today. And we're going to talk about picturing the Word, and even eventually the sensible, the feelings that the Gospel of John brings with it. And one thing I have is the St. John's Bible. Have any of you been acquainted with that? The handwritten? If you go to the Siebens building, under the stairs, have you been there? There is a fantastic display of one of the true facsimile copies. And the page is changed every day. And I urge you to go there and have a look. And this is, the Word became flesh. This is the opening. I have my facsimile here. If you want to see it closer, I can pass it around, but you have to wear gloves. But I think that's a fantastic piece. The Word became flesh, and the text combined with images. And I'll end with a famous picture that also combines text with images. So the three worlds of the text. What I'm going to do today is give you some skills, or remind you, you've probably heard this before, of how you can approach the gospel and how you can keep asking questions. As Pastor Vern was saying, he was giving you some hints as to how to read it for yourself. And I'm going to even suggest not only read it, but listen to it. And I'll give you a way to do that at the end. Behind the text, this gospel, it's a reminder, it's probably written between 90 and 100 AD, and most of us were not alive then. And we have to remind ourselves it's a strange world, and this text was written in Greek, and even a Greek that modern Greeks don't exactly speak. It's biblical Greek. It's Hellenistic Greek, Greco-Roman Greek. And Judaism had taken a shape after the Babylonian exile. Why is that important? I know that goes back to confirmation. But we're going to run into characters like the city of Jerusalem. Why is Jerusalem important for the story? And why are Pharisees important? They show up in the first chapter. Pharisees. Right? We tend to think of them as hypocrites. Isn't that how people... That's not who they are. They're devout people, but they're really important in the conflict and the encounter with Jesus. And then we have Sadducees. Well, you know that song. I don't want to be a Sadducee because I don't want to be sad, you see. Didn't you go to Bible camp? And the Zealots are a reminder that there is a real political tinge to the whole story. This is set in a time of Roman occupation, and if you've seen any of those old movies like Spartacus, the Romans were not nice. So, just to rehash, the Babylonian exile, remember the kingdom of David, 1000 BC? It fell apart. And they wandered, and the prophets came like Isaiah and Jeremiah and Hosea and Amos, and they said, things are not going the way they should, and if you don't reform, then God is going to let foreign nations take you over, and sure enough, they did. And the people of Jerusalem ended up in Babylon, 700-800 miles to the east, and they reflected on what had they done to get themselves here. And their conclusion was, we hadn't kept the law. And so out of the Babylonian experience in the mid-6th century BCE came this religion called Judaism, which was saying, how do we keep the law? And if we're going to keep it, we're going to keep it in our homes. We may not be a Jewish kingdom, but we can be a Jewish society. And so this is where the world of Jesus takes shape. And that's why they're worried about what can you do on a Sabbath. Right? Can you walk this far? Can you work? Can you heal? Who can you eat with? Remember, Jesus eats with the wrong people. Jesus' disciples don't fast in some of the Gospels. That comes out of this religion that took shape. How do we keep the law? And where's the law? The Ten Commandments are the summary, and the Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible, are the core. So by the time of Jesus, we have the Roman Empire. Notice how far the Roman Empire covers the entire Mediterranean Sea. And they called it our lake. Just think how different the politics are now. It's very different. Oh, if the Romans would only come back. And notice where Jerusalem is. It's in the outer reaches. It's the place where nobody has to go. Okay, pilot, you're heading to Jerusalem. Oh, crap. It's just trouble. Well, do what you need to do. And I was trying to take a picture of what was the Temple Mount, and these tourists got in the way. Bob and Joanne Shane, I think they're in there. No, this is advertising. We were in Jerusalem in June and had a wonderful time. The gold dome that you see is the Dome of the Rock, which is a Muslim building built around the 8th century of the Christian era, Common Era. And we think that's where the temple in Jerusalem stood. And the thing to remember as we read John's Gospel, as Jesus goes to the temple and clears it out of the marketplace, and he goes again for Passover, and he goes again to Jerusalem. When the people first heard John's Gospel, when John's Gospel was written, there was no temple. There was no Jerusalem. It had all been leveled by the Romans. So imagine you're reading a story that's alive, and engaging about a place that no longer exists. But then the question will be for the Christian community as it emerges from Judaism, does that mean God is gone from the world? And John's gospel is going to say, no. We're talking about Jesus. Remember he says, my temple, my body is the temple. Think how that was heard by the people who knew there was no temple. The world of the text. So with the world behind the text, we have to remember the historical setting. The world of the text. That's where we get into the story itself. And we're going to do a little practice of this later. We're going to look at words and how they repeat. We're going to look at characters and how they showed up. And then we're going to ask the question, what do I need to know to understand the story? Because this gospel wasn't written for PhD New Testament scholars. It was written for all of us. And the assumption is we can read it and get something out of it. So we have this Word made flesh, and that's going to set the tone for the whole story. Think about that. How many of you have read a book where you have a little preface? Netflix. How many watch Netflix? The Crown. Anybody watch The Crown? Okay, we go to the episode and we first read the summary. And if I start it too soon, Ruth will say, come back, we want to read the summary. And she's right, because that helps us understand what's going on. Or if you have your DVR and you look at the info for a show and you can get the summary, or if it's a repeat, I'm too much TV. And the disciples are called, and that's what the story we heard about in church today. And you get this guy named Cephas. Oh, and to the audience, does that ring a bell? Is he going to be a big player? Yeah. See, we're being led into the story. And then we get this performing of signs. 7 of them. No miracles in the Gospel of John. Word never appears. Matthew, Mark, and Luke talk about miracles. John never does. They're signs. Think about that. Okay. So John the Baptist is the first character. Is this where I want to go? Well, let's just talk about the character and how a character develops. So here are the characters. We read this in the text today. John, Jews, and we have to worry about the word Jews here, because this is where a lot of anti-Semitic readings of the Gospel of John have come from. The Jews. In Greek, it's the Judaioi. Translated literally Jews, but it's thought to be the officials, Jewish officialdom in Jerusalem and the temple. Not the common Jews, not the everyday members of the Jewish group, but kind of the people who are the elites, who are running the show, who may have come back from Babylon and said, we're in charge and we'll tell you what to do. So think of it in that context, not just Jews in general. It's an internal, and early Christianity was a Jewish movement. And so, who are the early Christians? They're all Jews too. So it's talking about maybe an elite group, a governing group, of people who are up here, and the rest of the Jews are down here. And so we have priests and Levites. See, the officials come to ask John, who are you? And he says, I am not the Messiah. Think about how this discussion, John has these lengthy discussions. And the thing to do is don't read them quickly, but read them aloud. And what's the author trying to tell you? He's going to set up the story early on that John is not the Messiah. Why would he do that? Why would an author take the time in the story and say, no, John is not the Messiah? What's the assumption about the audience? Some of them might have thought he was. It's like most laws come out of experience. The Bible just didn't make up. You notice there are no traffic laws in the Bible? No speed limits? It's because laws and rules and sometimes cautions come out of experience. So John is not the Messiah. He's not Elijah, nor the prophet. I'm not sure who the prophet is. Could be Isaiah. And then we have the Pharisees. So what do we have in this little passage? We have the players, the priests, the Pharisees, the people wondering who John is. John's not the guy. So who's going to be the guy? Jesus. So the world in front of the text, this is you. What we bring to a text when we read it. So the world behind the text is the historical setting. The world of the text is the story itself. And the world in front of the text is you and me as we stand and read these words. Some of them we think we know and some of them we don't. So the audience, we hear or read a text and we bring our own understanding to the story. So let me give you an example. The first two words of the Gospel of John in Greek, NRK, in beginning. They're the same words that begin Genesis 1:1 in the Greek Septuagint, the Bible of Hellenistic Jews in the 2nd century BCE. So if you're a Jew who knows the scripture in Greek and you hear NRK, what's the first thing that's going to come to your mind? I've heard that before. And where have I heard it? In Genesis. So where is this gospel taking me? If I know that, and what I'm doing is informing you, are you going to be the same reader of this text now after hearing this? Or maybe you knew this already. It takes you back to the beginning. It takes you back to the beginning of Torah. It takes you back to the beginning of the Jewish scriptures. And then it's going to take it into the life of Jesus. Wasn't that cool? I have figured out a fade out there. Okay, let me test you a little bit here. I'm going to give you some first lines to see if they resonate with you. The first line is 7 years ago.
Gettysburg.
Gettysburg Address, right? So I can make an allusion to that, and you're going to picture the Gettysburg Address. It was the best of times, it was the worst of times. Tale of Two Cities. Dickens. Life is difficult. The Road Less Traveled by M. Scott Peck. Anybody read that? It's a long time ago. When I was in my first call in Evanston, Illinois, I can't tell you how many men in the congregation told me I needed to read that book. And they were right. I actually heard M. Scott Peck speak there. It's still a good book. It's been out a long time. Scott Peck, he became a Christian later on in life, too. It's Not About You. Rick Warren, The Purpose-Driven Life. The last one, I Don't Do It for the Money. You want to guess? The Art of the Deal. So, but look at the reading dynamic here. You didn't recognize the line, but you recognize the title. So notice how you bring something. I was hoping you'd respond like that. So, but you bring something to the text. You see the role you as the reader play in that. Allusion is also big in the Gospel of John. Martin Luther King, remember his final talk? I've been to the mountaintop and have seen the promised land. Do you know where it's from? Deuteronomy. It's the last chapter of the book of Deuteronomy at Moses' farewell. King was a preacher. Do you think his audience knew where he got that from? You bet they did. They knew he was talking like Moses. Good Samaritan laws. Heard of them? Most states in the U.S. have them. A lot of people don't even know where the name comes from anymore. Too bad. Good we have the laws, but ironically, it misses the point of the story. And then to see the handwriting on the wall. You hear people use that phrase? You know where it's from? Daniel chapter 5. And of course, sometimes people confuse. It's a hand writing on the wall.
Oh.
Because they see a hand, and a lot of people put it together and say, handwriting. on the wall, which could be just graffiti. But still, it's entered the popular culture. But you still recognize that. You see that, and that's, imagine yourself the readers of John, and he starts talking about Bethesda, or the temple, or Sabbath. Is the audience going to know something about these things? It may be a distant memory, but they are. John 3:16 in popular culture. Who's the guy on the left? Tim Tebow. Where's he gone?
Announcing.
And I mean, remember John 3:16, for God so loved the world? It becomes almost trivialized in popular culture. It even made The Simpsons. So the guy with the rainbow hair gets parodied on The Simpsons, which shows actually deals with religion pretty well. But see, so we have to deal with aspects of John that get plucked out of the gospel and just thrown into popular culture. And if you read John 3, it's a different story. So how do we distinguish signal from noise? How do we distinguish the message from the message? John is one of 4 canonical gospels, all of which speak of the crucifixion. But John is a distinctive voice. So how do you be the same? How do you be different? That's something to keep in mind. So John is among the Gospels, and I have an arrow here. In church tradition, John is symbolized by the eagle as one who takes flight, and often people talk about John as being the spiritual gospel, as if it's unearthly. I would like to suggest just the opposite. I would like to suggest that John's spirituality is very down to earth. That's not often how it's read. So here I go to first lines from the gospel. Vern asked me to distinguish John from Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Can I take a couple minutes to do that?
Yes.
Matthew 1, yeah, thank you. I have my amen quarter back here. Somebody give me a witness out there. Yeah, I long to get a tent and do revivals. It'd be kind of fun. An account of the genealogy of Jesus the Messiah, son of David, son of Abraham. Abraham was the father of Isaac, Isaac the father of Jacob, the begats, right? Which is actually a serious discussion that gets parodied. That's Matthew. Mark, the beginning of the good news of Jesus Christ, the Son of God, as is written in the prophet Isaiah, seeing, I am sending my messenger ahead of you. And then we get John, dressed in camel's hair, leather belt. Jesus shows up. Luke, since many of you have undertaken to set down an orderly account. Oh man, that sounds like a dissertation, doesn't it? Just as they were handed on to us by those who, from the beginning, Luke is taking, and then he begins to tell the story of Zechariah, and the birth of John, and then the birth of Jesus. So if we had Mark, would we have Christmas? No. If you have Luke, you've got shepherds and no wise men. If you have Matthew, you have wise men and no shepherds. So your creche scenes are all wrong. And the Synoptic Gospels, just to remember, we think of them as having a shared view. Sometimes they're so close the words even match. And this is from the type of book we often use to compare them. Notice Matthew, Mark, and Luke. What's not there? John. Because John doesn't really work into it. They're here and there. Feeding of the 5,000, the crucifixion. But John doesn't show up in the same way. And so we kind of blend them all together, don't we, when we read? Sometimes it's good to set them apart. So some things can be fusing. Take Lazarus. He was our guide in Israel this summer, but Lazarus is the name of a poor man in a parable about Lazarus and the rich man. That's the only place the name Lazarus shows up in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and only in Luke. But in John, Lazarus is the brother of Mary and Martha who dies and whom Jesus raises. See, that can be confusing. Are they the same guy? And John has signs and not miracles, as I said. Changing water into wine at Cana in chapter 2. Healing the Roman son in Capernaum. Healing the paralytic. Feeding the 5,000. That's in the Synoptics too. Walking on water. That seems to show up in all the Gospels. Healing the blind man. That's only in John. And the raising of Lazarus. Only in John. These are all signs. 7. Oh, now let's go to your sheets. You got them? So what I've taken here is the first 18 verses of John's Gospel, which is traditionally called the poetic prologue. And what I've done is highlighted words that stand out. And what you can do in John's Gospel is you can go and print out, or if you have a Bible, I urge students to write in their Bibles. That's a sign that's what the medieval people did. They wrote in their Bibles. You can do it. Bach did it. Somebody found Bach's Bible. It was full of notes. You can do the same. Like, I don't know this word. Who's that? Oh, that's cool. Stuff like that. Just don't use the yellow marker. You're wasting your time if you do that. So in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. All things came into being through him, and without him, not one thing came into being. What words have been repeated here? Word, and the Greek is logos. What else has been repeated? God. So notice it shifts back and forth. Sometimes we have layers of meaning, and John doesn't want to say, yes, Jesus is God. We only have one scene late in the Gospel where we have Thomas kneeling at Jesus and saying, my Lord and my God. That's a little too crass for John's Gospel. It's trying to put them together. But let's talk about the word logos. So you can substitute the word word with the word logos. But let me suggest ways that was understood. To the Hellenistic Jew, the logos could be Torah. And so let's first take the word word and replace it with Torah. Should we read it that way? In the beginning was the Torah, and the Torah was with God, and the Torah was God. Would that make sense to a Hellenistic Greek-speaking Jew of the first century? It might. So could they hear this opening and say, that's speaking to me? They could. To the Greek philosopher, or street preacher, or stoic, or cynic, or one of those lifestyle movements in the Greco-Roman world, logos was the principle of reason which gave coherence to the world. So if we said in the beginning was that principle of reason, the logos, and the logos, this principle of reason that holds the world together, was with God, and this principle of reason was God. Would that make sense to a Hellenistic Greco-Roman person? It could. So do you see how we have layers? And we hear words, but we don't always hear the same thing. But this is part of the genius of John's Gospel. Let's go down to verse 14. What does it say there about this Torah principle that governs the universe, that binds reality together? What happens to it? Became flesh. And what would the person, how would one react to that? What? What? How can something abstract become flesh? How can something like Torah become flesh? How can something like a promise become a person? Do you see the problem with that? But you see how that's the core of where John is going? So the word logos won't appear after that verse. That's the last time it appears in the entire gospel. Who's going to appear? Jesus. See how it's setting the stage? The writer wants you to keep that in mind as now you hear the stories of Jesus. See how that gives a depth and a richness to your understanding. So how does the meaning of God change? Sometimes we tend to take the word God and we have abstract notions about what God is. Who is God? If you were to say that, what are some qualities of God? Want to throw them out? Yeah, God's the creator. Omnipotent. We love those. Omniscient. Knows everything. Omnipresent. Everywhere. Is that what John says here? Who is God defined by? God is the Father of the Son. God is tied to this logos, this word. So you can't understand God in this gospel apart from God's connection with Jesus, because what does Jesus do with respect to God and you? Can you see God? No. Can you see Jesus? Yes. And if you see Jesus, who do you see? You see God. That's where this gospel is taking you. God isn't an abstraction. That's why I say it's not a spirit up in the sky. It's about God being active, present in the midst of us. I just want to throw this in. There are other little clips of this notion of Jesus connected to God and creation elsewhere in the New Testament. We call them little, like the first 18 verses of John, they may have existed in early Christianity, and this is a remnant of the earliest Christian belief. They somehow, from the start, thought Jesus, believed Jesus, knew Jesus, was elevated to God's presence. And notice that in Him, in Jesus, this creation, all things hold together. Doesn't that fit with John's understanding of logos? You didn't expect to find that in Colossians, did you? You don't really read Colossians. Because we don't know how to read it. I don't blame you. And in Him, the fullness, that's the pleroma of the same word that appears in John's Gospel. So we get a little window into how they understood Jesus to be present in a God-like way in their community in the resurrection. Philippians 2, the same way. Who, though He was in the form of God, did not regard equality with God as something to be exploited. This is kind of it's not Johannine, but it's this notion of a pre-existent Christ who descends into the world, becomes flesh, and taking on human form and humbled Himself. That's a similar kind of almost poetic idea. Just thought I'd throw that in there. So let's talk a few other words to look for in the gospel. Light and darkness. Light is going to be good, darkness bad. Can you make a note on your hand so you remember that? But it's not just about light, it's about understanding. And so let's look at the text here. What came into being in Him, I'm looking at the verse 4, the first paragraph under John 1. What came into being in Him was life, and the life was the light of all people. So what's light connected to here? Life. Think about that as we read into stories that come. Jesus will talk about giving life. We'll talk about this more next week, a blind man who can't see, but who believes. And in a sense, what's more important, seeing light or believing and seeing who Jesus is? Believing. And so Jesus, the light of the world, as we'll say, will stand before Pilate in the final chapters. And will Pilate see Him for who He is? No. So Pilate will be in darkness, even though the light is there. And notice in the first chapter 2, the light shined in the darkness, and the darkness did not overcome it. The word there is, it has to do with grasping. The darkness did not, I sometimes think, clench it in its fist. We think of darkness as powerful, but what is the light? It's more powerful. Can the darkness overcome it? Is that a word that a metaphor you can keep in your mind every day? Think about that as words that you can repeat to yourself that will shape. John's gospel is meant to create a world for you. And you enter into that world, and then it becomes a life-changing experience. John 3, Nicodemus, on the right side of your page. Let's just take a test and put this light and dark thing. Do I have another 5 minutes?
Yeah.
We're coming up. Time is shorter these days. And I've got one more joke. Now there was a Pharisee named Nicodemus, a leader of the Jews. There we have that word Jews again. Remember, what did I say? This refers to officialdom, not Jews in general. He came to Jesus by night. Okay, how heavily laden does that symbolize? What's the quality of night? Dark. So do you think that might be symbolic, but also has a touch of reality here? He wants to hide his identity. He kind of knows who Jesus is, but doesn't entirely. So here he is in the dark, dealing with the light. And John's Gospel wants us to think about that. He sees the signs. Notice that? For no one can do these signs you do apart from the presence of God. So what does Nicodemus know? That Jesus does signs, and that has something to do with God. But has he fully made the connection yet? He'll show up at the crucifixion. So think of Nicodemus as one of these characters that we have here and we'll have at the end. Think of how that brackets the story. The word world. This is my last joke. I promise. He was in the world, and the world came into being through him. Now, the Greek word for world is cosmos. And the thing is, we usually think, when we think of cosmos, what do we think of? Carl Sagan. Or who's the new Carl Sagan replacement? What's that? Yeah. Neil deGrasse Tyson, who's fantastic. But they didn't have a concept of a globe. Think of world as, look around the room. I mean, seriously, look behind you. We're the world. The world can have a social dimension in John's Gospel, so that's why I have a picture of Cosmo. Cosmos, cosmopolitan. Cosmopolitan literally means the city of the world. But don't buy it, it's a little salacious. Get fit secrets for a tight bod, that's what every Christian should have. So that's my joke. Think of this as the world, because look at what the world will do. The world came into being through him. Yet, if you look at verse 10, what's the quality of the world? It doesn't know him. So think of that not as the earth or a globe, think of that as society. And is it just strictly a Jewish society here? No. That's an inclusive term. The world does not know him. That's going to resonate with John's Gospel and John's community. One more minute.
Yep.
I'm going to throw this one out. Glory. It often gets, the Greek word is doxa. And it often gets translated as glory, which we think of as visual, shining, bright, white. What I'd like to suggest to you, it has to do with honor and shame. And this, I kind of go this route. I don't think it often gets translated that way in John's Gospel. It tends to be always glory. But think of that as honor. Jesus' crucifixion will be the moment of his glorification. We'll talk about that. But the irony here is that will be his lifted up, that will be his honoring. But to the world who doesn't see the light, what will they see that as? Failure, darkness. So we're going to deal with this reversal of what honor, which is with God, and what shame is. The world will confuse the two. Glory can also have a visual, shining aspect, but I'd like you to have a richer set of layers of meaning. And my final picture then is this crucifixion scene from the 14th century, the Grunewald altarpiece from Isenheim in Germany. And think of this picture as a visual summary as I end of the Gospel of John. We have Jesus on the cross with the sign, Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews. John here with a long finger pointing to Jesus. As we always see a lamb with a goblet, a chalice, and a cross. Like all lambs, they carry chalices. Is this meant to be a realistic picture? No. This is John from chapter 1, behold the Lamb of God, right? And so there's a little text here saying, I must decrease that he might increase. That's right out of John's gospel. And here we're taken to the crucifixion. Mary, the disciple whom Jesus loved, and then Mary Magdalene. This is not in real time. Are you aware of this? This is a compression of the beginning and the end of the gospel. So I want to end today with that picture. The crucified Jesus, John pointing, Mary and the disciple whom Jesus loved, and the Lamb of God. These are images, pictures, that will help you remember John's gospel as we move on to the rest of the gospel next week. With that, I'll end. Thank you. Oh, one last. I told you a way to study. BibleGateway.com. Any of you know about this? It is a free, you can find it on the internet, also an app, and they have a free audio Bible. You can listen to someone read the King James, the NIV, or the Message. And I would urge you to try it out and listen. So I listen to 6 or 7 chapters at a time, and it's a totally different experience. So that's my other recommendation, and I don't get any remuneration for mentioning them either. Okay, thank you. There we go.